and that as humans we cannot provide a God's eye view. We're not objective, and the humanities help us to deal with the inevitable subjectivity of being human and to enter compassionately into points of view that we don't routinely inhabit. Literacy in its broadest sense is a tool of survival. Orwell warned us, as others have, that the power of tyrants rests largely on the control of language, representation, and story. And we have ample examples of that in the world around us. Our students need to know about narrative spin. They need to raise questions about embedded reporting. They need to recognize the vested interests behind politically and corporately sponsored messages. They need to raise questions about the assumptions that writers make. They need to raise questions about the assumptions Thomas Friedman makes if he's going to be required. They need to recognize how the Bible can be misread and misused to justify acts of atrocity, and it has been. They need to develop criteria of credibility and to enter into public discourse as wise as serpents, equipped to ask critical questions and to move from what to how to why to who and when and where. That little quiver of interrogatives is indispensable equipment. And I think it's sufficient, if it's well used, to enable them, like David with his 5 smooth stones, to speak truth to power where power is being abused, and to speak for the poor because that is the first obligation of privilege. To have the time to read Chaucer or Melville or Toni Morrison or Tsitsi Dangaremga or Arundhati Roy is a privilege, but it's not peripheral to the work of survival. The world needs people who will read deeply and reflect imaginatively and generously on the stories and images that people everywhere produce, understanding that each of those stories or images is a stay against the confusions of oversimplified, jargon-ridden propaganda. So let me just finish with one of my favorite lines from William Carlos Williams, who said, "It is difficult to get the news from poems, yet men die miserably every day for lack of what is found there." Thank you.
Thank you. I too am honored to be invited here to speak. Those of you who have read J.M. Coetzee's Elizabeth Costello perhaps remember one chapter entitled The Humanities in Africa. The chapter stages a debate between 2 characters. On the one side is Blanche, a Christian missionary to Africa. She delivers a scathing indictment of the humanities. According to Blanche, the humanities are guilty of an incipient moral relativism and, given their focus on what she calls the arid, narrowed form of textual scholarship, are irrelevant and unrealistic in an African context, which she argues is riven through with suffering. On the other side stands Elizabeth Costello, who perhaps mirrors some of the arguments of Coetzee himself. Elizabeth offers a defense of the humanities. She argues that the humanities reveal what is essentially human by revealing the peculiar capacity to appreciate beauty. Moreover, the humanities can even help us transcend the agonies of the body. Now, the book is a lot more interesting than my summary, but I think both of those positions are flawed, if I may say so myself. Blanche, contemptuous of the humanities, illustrates what is right with a certain articulation of the humanities. Elizabeth, apologist for the humanities, with what's wrong with a certain strain within the humanities. Blanche's epistemological absolutism suffers from the usual vices of anti-intellectualism. It wants to cut us off from the joys of learning, including the learning provided by the humanities, like argumentation, which establishes the truth, and often our many truths, interpretation, which teaches us about the complexity of the world we live in, imagination, which allows for diversity and alternatives, performance, which opens up our capacities for and societal creation. But this anti-intellectualism also carries social and political consequences. She reduces Africans to suffering bodies. One hears in her voice the fanatical echoes of the crusading missionary. It shouldn't surprise us that her dismissal of the humanities as impractical bears the same accent as the current attack on the humanities as not consumer-driven here in the United States, or not consumer-driven enough. Whether it's the politician focused on the bottom line, or the missionary focused on a grim counting of converts, the humanities' interest in conversation, critique, curiosity, questions, sometimes must seem, dare we say it, rather otherworldly, and maybe for a good reason. Elizabeth Costello, on her part, inherits the status mongering that has long marked a certain strain of the humanities. What she conceives of as the humanities is, of course, a very male, very upper class, very elite North Atlantic Treaty Organization humanities. What masquerades as learning is actually a mechanism for legitimating power. We know that there's long been a historical strain in the humanities, articulated powerfully by humanists such as Petrarch, which conceived of the humanities as a means of distinguishing oneself from the vulgar. So in other words, this snobbery is no less anti-intellectual than Blanche's immaculate mind. Elizabeth has to work extremely hard to be ignorant of African, Asian, Latin American arts and letters. Moreover, it advances a dubious essentialism about humanity. In this critique, we already see then the outlines for a genuinely global humanities, advancing an enjoyment of the intellectual life, which includes teaching about argumentation, interpretation, imagination, and performance that I've talked about. And we know that historically, in the United States, that has long been a problem. We have an anti-intellectual history, which perhaps the humanities try to engage with. But it also involves a radical critique. Just as Christian liberal arts education is not liberal arts plus a Christian coating, I believe that the humanities as we conceive it and practice it here at Westmont should involve a radical reconceptualization of what the humanities themselves are. In other words, I hope an encounter with the global should not mean just doing much, just putting in more classes in the global, but critiquing the very terms of the debate. An example, perhaps, that you know that the notion of the Western is a very sort of historical term. I mean, there was a time, after all, when the Ottoman Empire was conceived by many European powers as an heir to the Western, you know. So the notion of the Western itself ought to be ripe for critique and historicization. And a healthy skepticism about human essentialism is also part of it. And so here we'll move from thinking of the humanities as something essentially human to thinking about how it intersects and articulates with the social sciences, with the natural sciences. And so here we have a concern with not just putting humans at the center of our civilizations, but animals too, the environment as well. Thank you.